Muito boa tarde a todos. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to another session of the Simpósio-Filamentos of the Atlantic Heritage. Muito boa tarde mais uma vez para todos. Bem-vindos a mais uma sessão do Simpósio Literário Filamentos da Herança Atlântica, que, como tenho vindo a anunciar, é o nosso 16º, a 16ª edição. Tivemos 12 edições presenciais, entre 1990 e 2002, depois de um interregno de 20 anos e recomeçamos, praticamente 20 anos, e recomeçamos, portanto, nos últimos 4, portanto, este é o 16º. Vamos fazer esta sessão em inglês, so I'll be transitioning to English. Welcome to the students who are following us here through Fresno State, and welcome colleagues and friends, and welcome to those who are following us as well on various social media outlets. And of course through PBBI's Facebook page and my personal as well. And a billion thanks to the groups. Last time I said we had 40, but ended up we had over 50 groups that agreed to also share, and that is important. And we thank them because that allows us to reach quite a few more people. So, Filaments of the Atlantic Heritage, as we gather at the confluence of memory and vision, where the winds of the Atlantic carry the voices of the islands, which are voices of that are resilient, that are creative, and that are eternal. Filaments of the Atlantic Heritage is more than a symposium. We like to think it as a living mosaic of heritage, tribute to the enduring spirit of the Azorian people and their diaspora voyages across the Americas, from California to Brazil, from Canada to Bermuda, from libraries to live streams. We braid together the threads of culture, intellect, and creativity. Our vision is cultivating a space where the Azorian soul, better said, can be in many tongues, can speak in many tongues, and it does so through poetry, through prose, through history, through scholarship, through journalism, through performance, and through conversation. Doing so ignites a transatlantic dialogue that affirms identity as well as honoring ancestry and, most important, inspiring the future. Our purpose of this symposium is threefold. Number one, to celebrate the Azorian legacy in the Americas in its many forms. Number two, to engage generations across the diaspora in a meaningful dialogue and artistic expression. And number three, to build enduring structures of knowledge, of visibility, and of empowerment. From presentations from the Azorian diaspora across the America to the creative spirit of Americans, Canadians, Bermudans, and Brazilians with Azorian ancestry, from Azorian autonomy, cultural and historical heritage to the insights of scholars and historians and poets and writers and cultural leaders across continents, we are assembling the many parts of one shared story. And such a story is the story of the Portuguese in Bermuda, as you can see there by the title and the leading slide presentation. We're happy to have Eduardo Pereira Medeiros, who is a young historian from the beautiful island of São Miguel, who did his studies at the University of the Azores, who has a bachelor's in history from the University of the Azores and postgraduate work in cultural tourism and also in cultural and international tourism management, and who, from the same institution, from the Universidade dos Açores, University of the Azores, who has written extensively about diaspora experiences. His book, Azores, United States of America, in 2021, is a book that needs to be translated to English, of course, and have it also include other parts that he's working on, I know. And in 2023 was a book dedicated to the Azores in Canada. And most recently, this book that he'll be talking about, his research that took him over 2 years to do on the 175th anniversary of the Portuguese presence to Bermuda. And so we welcome the historian Eduardo Pereira Medeiros, Bem-vindo, muito obrigado, and welcome to Fresno State, albeit virtually, hopefully one day in person.
Good evening. Thank you very much for this opportunity to talk here about the research and what is covered with this book. And thank you very much for the opportunity to speak here, especially to Mr. Dinesh Borges. So my name is Eduardo Pereira Medeiros. I'm a historian. I was born and raised on the island of São Miguel, which is the island where I live. And today I'm going to talk to you about the history of the Portuguese in Bermuda. So right here in the cover, it's the cover of the book that in English. It was translated to English and also available in Portuguese. So first of all, I could not forget to thank my sponsors that helped to have this book printed and presented in Bermuda. But so going forward to the research, there was not that much written about the Portuguese in Bermuda. There was a book from a lady called Patricia Mudd, focused more on genealogy, but not much in history. So this was the first deep research in the history of the Portuguese in Bermuda. So how was the research done? First of all, from July 2022, that's when it started. Started in the research in the archives of Ponta Delgada, passports, newspapers from this island, and online I searched the archives of Angra do Heroísmo and Horta, so Terceira and Faial, respectively. Then January, I went to Bermuda and remained there for around 3 months until March 2023, and that was where I did most of my research. So in Bermuda, I did research in the Bermudan archives, including passports, minutes from the Executive Council of Bermuda, cabinet minutes, that's from the government as well, memorandums for the Executive Council, immigration from Bermuda, reports from the Board of Agriculture, Board of Immigration, and many other sources. Libraries in the Azores, books, in the Bermuda National Library, books, newspapers, including Bermuda Sun, Mid-Ocean News, and of course, Royal Gazette. And in Bermuda, and here, interviewed people from the Azorean/Portuguese community and some Bermudians. From April 23 until September 24 was the writing, and also I had the opportunity to go to the mainland and do some research in the archives of the Foreign Affairs Ministry in Lisbon, Portugal, mainland. From January to March 2024, I also did research in the Royal Gazette, the newspaper, the most spread newspaper in Bermuda, online from the 1830s until 1940s, and even after that. So the book it's split between 5 chapters. So besides introduction, conclusion, first one is about Azores and Bermuda, just to give some data to the readers. Then second chapter, Portuguese in Bermuda already in the 16th century, navigators. Of course, Portuguese got everywhere. And third chapter, Bermuda in the 19th century and introduction of Portuguese immigrants. The first ones were from Madeira, as I'll explain. Then 4th century, and that's the one that takes more pages in the book. Bermuda in the 20th and 21st centuries and immigration from the Azores. The big part, I will say 95 or more percent of the Portuguese in Bermuda are from the Azores, and therefore this focus on the Azores. And then the 5th chapter, the Azorean/Portuguese mark in Bermuda. The book, it's around 736 pages in Portuguese, 696 in English, and of course, the ones that have more pages are number 3 and 4. So going to chapter number 1, this chapter was very important for the reader to know what's the geographical spaces we're talking about. So we're talking about Azores and Bermuda, 2 archipelagos, 1 Portuguese, 1 is considered overseas British territory. And of course, the connection between Azores and Bermuda, it's essentially a connection between San Miguel and Bermuda, but not only. So in the book, I talk about bit, just some pages, just some paragraphs about the Azores, its history, and then about Bermuda. And of course, just some geographical comparison between the Azores and Bermuda. So Azores, nowadays, according to the last census, 2021, more than 230,000 people. San Miguel only 133,000 approximately, and Terceira, which is the second most populated, 53,000 people. Bermuda, on the other hand, it's a much, much smaller territory. The only island in the Azores that's smaller than Bermuda is Corfu. Nevertheless, Bermuda has more population than Terceira Island. So Bermuda has around 53.36 square kilometers. And just for example, San Miguel is 13.94 times bigger than Bermuda, although Bermuda has almost just a bit less than half of the population of San Miguel. And therefore, a reflection of the density of the population. So Bermuda has a way higher population density compared to the Azores and San Miguel. As you can see over here, 1,190 people per square kilometers in Bermuda. So what is Bermuda? Bermuda, it's an archipelago with 150 small islands and islets, 6 bigger islands, and they were originated from sand dunes. Subtropical climate, at or around 1,000 kilometers west-northwest from North Carolina, United States, and these islands were discovered way later than the Azores by Juan Bermudez, a Spanish sailor, 1505. But the settlement only started in the 1600s with the English settlers. First shipwreck of a British ship was Sea Venture, and the settlement of Bermuda started later on. Nowadays, Bermuda, the population, big part of it, it's racially, it's black. Then there's a minority that's white, and of course, mixed population as well. Just a curiosity, Bermuda has its own constitution since 1968 and has the oldest parliament in the American continent. That goes back to the 17th century. So just some pictures of what Bermuda is. It's an authentic paradise with cyan blue waters and a multicultural culture and very beautiful architecture, neo-Gothic, like this cathedral and many other churches and temples from different religions. And of course, the beaches are definitely the number one thing. And here, the left, their own parliament, and the right, the front street, which is a very funny place to visit, and very beautiful colors. And of course, as you can see, the sky most of the times is clear, has an amazing climate. So going into chapter number 2, we have Portuguese in Bermuda in the 16th century. So the first Portuguese I saw with some connection to Bermuda was Estevão Gomes. So after the voyage with Fernão Magalhães, Estevão Gomes searched for a way to Asia by the north, by the Atlantic North, and he got to the United States, and he passed by Bermuda. Was the first Portuguese to get some contact with Bermuda. Then 1527, Fernando or Hernando Camelo, so written with the two ways, and a noble from San Miguel received the authorization to sail in Bermuda by Charles V of Spain. It never got to become something real. As I say, the settlement always started with the English in the 17th century, but it was a very interesting fact. And besides that, in 1543, there was a Portuguese ship that shipwrecked in Bermuda, and people believe it left the sailors left an inscription in a rock on the south side of Bermuda, and more precisely in Spittal Pound area nowadays. Going to the 19th century, that's when the immigration started, and so we always make these questions to know what we want to reach, and of course, why the need to import labor. Why did Bermuda need to import labor in the 19th century? Why Portuguese immigrants specifically, and why were they from Madeira? And on the other hand, why did these Madeiran people needed to immigrate besides the argument of just in the search for a better life? And so going to economic situation in Bermuda in 1830s and 1840s, Bermuda had the importance of the salt production. It was a big part of the economy. Decades before had decreased. Shipbuilding industry was way less important than in the 1700s. Not many cedars in the Bermudian landscape, therefore not much material to build the ships. And besides that, the evolution of technology. Steamships were becoming the most common ships used for navigating. Last but not least, War of 1812 that put against Great Britain and the United States. Bermuda was afraid that the United States and Great Britain could be in war again, and Bermuda needed to produce its own food. Bermuda started to rely a lot in the United States in the 1700s because it focused on the shipbuilding and could just import its food from the United States. So there was some struggle with the War of Independence and then War of 1812. On the other hand, situation on the Madeira Island in 1840s. First of all, we have a Protestant faith spreading in Madeira, especially because of the Dr. Robert Kelly, British doctor, that started to spread the Protestant faith amongst the Madeiran people. There was a slightly problem over there. It was that this was illegal by law, was illegal by the Carta Constitucional, the constitution of the country. All the non-Portuguese people were the only, sorry, the non-Portuguese people were the only ones allowed to have a non-Catholic religion. Everyone that had Portuguese citizenship had to be Catholic, and spreading the non-Catholic faith among these people was a crime. So in Madeira, many Protestants started to be prosecuted, beaten, arrested, houses were burned, and Cayley even ended up fleeing with his wife to England. Meanwhile, at the same time, slavery had been abolished in the British Empire and cheap labor was needed. Many Protestant Madeirans started to immigrate to the West Indies, search for religious freedom, but also for a better life. And at the same time, also Madeira had some problems with lack of potatoes in that decade, and even a big hunger in 1847. Going into this emigration of Portuguese to the West Indies, we have first Azorians from Fayal going to Trinidad in 1834. Terrible experience. Some of them were buried in just common graves. In the 1840s, many hundreds of Madeirans going to St. Vincent, Trinidad, Guyana, and Antigua. So why did the necessity for Madeiran immigrants? Cheap labor for agricultural work in the West Indies, to increase the European population versus the free African population were slaves. So some racist motives to increase the white population, and also to keep the balances between free and free whites and free black. And also the Madeiran immigrant was considered a hard working class of people, cheap labor, and came from a similar climate. And also, last but not least, peaceful people. Didn't do much rebellions compared to the former slaves. In the West Indies, something that happened and would later happen in Bermuda was that the Portuguese were not considered whites. Just like in Bermuda, many times they use the term Portuguese, just also like in the United States. So let's talk about the economic and social situation in Madeira, some national instability just after the Civil War, year of hunger in 1847, decrease of the price of the wine of Madeira, and of course, immigration was a way to escape the army service. Therefore, with these problems in Madeira, end of slavery in British Empire, around 18,000 Madeiras immigrated to the Americas between 1834 and 1852. It's a big number, consider that in these days, Madeira had just around 120, 130,000 people. Going down back to Bermuda, we have in 1839 a new government arriving, Mr. William Reed, and he supported introduction of European immigrants for agriculture. So I already explained the economic situation in Bermuda. In 1845, government approves grants of money to people who introduced immigrants in Bermuda. So the idea was to give money to people who wanted to get immigrants in Bermuda. So this money will be used to pay for the ship and all of the other paperwork. And why immigrants? So what William Reed said in the colonial parliament in Bermuda is that this importation of people, of European laborers, was not so much from the amount of additional labor, but from these persons bringing with them habits of active industry, improved methods of applying manual labor, and combining it with the labor of cattle and mechanical conveyances. So was not necessarily an importation of arms or muscles, but an importation of knowledge, an importation of this knowledge of agriculture. Bermudians had dedicated in the past a lot to shipbuilding, and they just started to import all the food. So now Bermuda wanted to change its economy to agriculture, first for local consumption and later for exports, especially for the fresh markets in the United States. So 1846, we have a new governor, Charles Eliot, arrives at Bermuda. And this year, people start to ask to introduce English immigrants. Pardon. 1847 have a sum of 400 pounds approved to introduce immigrants, and this money will be used to get some German, some English, and then in 1849, 58 Madeirans. 1847, Bermuda starts to hear about the good results of Madeiran immigration in on the West Indies, part of the British Empire, Antigua and Grenada, and of course, they were hardworking, could live. This is a quote from a newspaper at the time. they could live entirely on onions and potatoes, so they were a cheap labor to maintain. 1849, it's also mentioned in the Royal Gazette that the climate in Madeira was similar to Bermuda, hot, humid, and also they keep showing the good results of the Madeiran immigration to Trinidad and the success of these immigrants. So what happens that they send a ship in September to in August, and it reaches Madeira on October the 2nd. So this ship, the captain was called Watlington, and he is received in Madeira by Osmond Jones. This is the name I discovered. He was a foreign agent in Madeira. Unfortunately, I couldn't find much in Madeira besides this newspaper. But Osmond Jones was, as far as I got to know, was a foreign agent in Madeira. He had family in Bermuda, and he helped Washington to get in immigrants from Madeira to go to Bermuda. On the newspaper, Madeira, they got it wrong. They wrote Washington, but his name was Watling. And then he went back to Bermuda and arrived there on November the 4th, 1849. That's why last year we celebrated 175 years of Portuguese in Bermuda. Total of 58 immigrants, amongst them 7 children and 16 women. So here's a voucher. That's also the back cover of the book. That's a voucher that Washington had to write with the names of the immigrants and the people, the subscribers that applied to get this immigrants. An interesting thing, that also a myth that I had the chance to kind of prove it's not correct, is that people used to say that the onion seeds that Bermuda started to use came with the immigrants. And I found importation of Madeiran onion seeds way before the immigrants, so 1826, 1840, and even from Fayal in 1841. Going to the second half of the 1800s, Madeiran immigration was successful, and so Bermuda wanted more immigrants. So more grants of money were approved to introduce immigrants in Bermuda. And 1858, a ship is sent to Madeira or Azores. I found both names, but got lost at sea and never got immigrants. 1862, Board of Immigration is formed, and it states specifically in the legislation that the goal with this Board of Immigration was to introduce immigrants from Great Britain, Ireland, Channel Islands, Germany, Madeira, or Azores, or Western Islands, as many times it shows up. 1864, a new Immigration Act, and 1865, a new attempt to introduce immigrants from Portuguese territories, but it failed. They tried in Porto, they tried in the Azores, and even Germany. But in Germany, it's interesting, there was like a fever to everybody to go to the United States, and they didn't succeed in taking German immigrants to Bermuda again. 1870s, there's a lot of Swedish immigrants that are introduced in Bermuda, but many left for the United States later, where they had family. Last but not least, 1876, there's a ship called Modesta that I found the records of it from Fayal, and this ship was sailing to the United States. When it stopped in Bermuda, it had way more people than it had here in the Azores. So according to the passport records of the Azores, so there were a lot of illegals on board the ship. They stopped in Bermuda. Bermuda tried to make contracts with them, only with the legals, but the legals had their lives made in the US already. And the ship was then, the parts of the ship was very damaged, were sold in Bermuda in auction, and the people went to the United States on board steamships. But the immigrants went to New Bedford and New York, and some of them to California. Also, in the 1870s, 80s, and 90s, when we start to have a bigger and stronger Azorian community in Bermuda. So, and also some Cape Verdeans. They got there through whaling ships. So therefore, again, illegally, we went everywhere aboard whaling ships. And 1870s, 80s, and 90s, we also have Azorians arriving at Bermuda, coming from the United States to work on winter time, and then went back to the United States on summertime, and many stayed. In the 1880s, when Azorians started to ask to introduce relatives in Bermuda. And I found records of Azorians in Bermuda from the islands on the 19th century. From San Miguel, Santa Maria, São Jorge, Graciosa, Fayal, and even Flores. And this amount of Portuguese citizens makes perfect sense for the government, for the Portuguese government, to start a Portuguese consul in Bermuda that started back in 1883 with John S. Darrell, which remained until 1922. This painting over here on the right is a beautiful painting that's on the National Museum of Bermuda, and it has more than 400 years of Bermuda depicted. And the painter was very good at depicting the Azorians. So here we have this couple with onions and tomatoes, crops the Azorians used to grow a lot. And in the back, with the lady with the skirt and the gentleman with the hood, just like the Madeiran typical hood. And even here, typical Portuguese food: some bread, some chorizo, and of course, some olive oil. So I found that I've also on the book I displayed some documents from requests to introduce immigrants, and I found these beautiful pictures from the late 1800s, beginning of 1900s, of the Azorians, Portuguese in Bermuda from different islands. Also, very interesting, in 1890, Portuguese Azorians, more specifically, started a Protestant church in Bermuda. Started with Manuel Cordeiro Benevides. He was from San Miguel Island, had been converted to Protestantism here in San Miguel. His two brothers were already in Bermuda, and he migrated to Bermuda and started there this religious movement. Even nowadays, this church is still active. It has, as you see on the right, the Evangelical Church. That's the current building, and the one in the middle, it's on the other part of the island, also started by Azorians and had mass services in Portuguese. So for a long time in Bermuda, to go to the church and talk with Portuguese and have services in Portuguese were Protestant churches. Going to the 20th century, 21st, 1900s, 1910s, very few amount of people immigrated to Bermuda, according to the passport records, but some Azorians applying to be British subjects. So in 1900, there were already 414 Portuguese people in Bermuda, but according to the newspapers, there were many more people than that lived more or less in Bermuda. So they lived during the agricultural season and then moved back to the US and in summertime. And it happens that also some of them were already American citizens. So some of them had already been born in the US, were American citizens, but had a Portuguese surname. And that's why the newspapers say they're Portuguese nevertheless. So ethnically they were Portuguese. Also, in these 2 decades, we have some Black Bermudians immigrating to the US and being replaced by the Portuguese on the fields. Not only immigrating to the US, but also emigrating to other economic activities, more precisely tourism. So the tourism contributed to have way less Bermudians, white or black, in the agriculture. So on the newspaper, Royal Gazette, the very funny quote is that it is easier to drive a carriage for 3 or 4 months and ill the rest of the year. And so long as the system of tips is invoked, such employment is very lucrative. So it's much more lucrative to work in tourist businesses rather than agriculture, and way less work. So agriculture started to become weaker and weaker as the main economic activity, not only because of tourism, but also because of competition from southern states like Texas, producing the same products Bermuda produced and exporting to the same markets Bermuda exported to, more precisely New York City, and also refrigeration systems, technology started to become more developed, and therefore there was not such a big need for fresh vegetables because they could get from closer and cheaper. Also in on these decades, Portuguese were improving their businesses, their lives, starting grocery shops and even factories. So you have here, there was a factory to can tomatoes by J.J. Moniz, a gentleman that was from Calhetas on the island of San Miguel, close to Cabo de Peixe and Ribeira Grande. Going to the 1920s, that's one of the decades where Azorians immigrated more by the hundreds, so much so that some of the years in the 20s, in the 30s, Bermuda received more Azorians than United States. So in the 20s, Bermuda was the #1 destination considering its size. And why? Were U.S. closed to immigration? According to the immigration policy at the time, the United States was much closer to southern immigrants. The United States had to remain, according to the racist tendencies of the time, WASP, Anglo-Saxon, and Protestant, something that the Azorians were not. And in 1922, Bermuda creates the Immigrant Labor Board to negotiate with these governments to bring immigrant workers. So part of the plan of the immigrant labor was to bring between 100 and 150 Azorian workers with a cost of 1,500 pounds to the colony. These Azorians were to be selected by a Portuguese living here in the Azores that had been living in Bermuda for many years, and also with the help from from the British consul in Ponta Delgada. So in 1823, that's when the first big uh, group of Azorians emigrated to Bermuda in the 20th century, boarding the ship Asia, and a total of 96 people. They arrived on Bermuda on a Good Friday on March 13th, 1923. On this decade, other hundreds and hundreds of Azorians were going to be imported to the Bermuda. Importation of immigrants, imported, that's always a word that they use in the documents, in the press. I just use the verb to use. Okay? And most of these people were for agriculture, but also for many other jobs, mechanics, masons, all sort of different things. And they could bring their families in this time. So it was a family immigration in the 1920s. Now going to 1929, Azorians come to Bermuda to work on a golf course, and they were engaged by John Fall, who got them to Bermuda to work in this big project. And then from in the they did Tuckerstown and the Castle Howard Hotel, which was a big hotel for its time. Uh, and in 1930, more hundreds of Azorians got to Bermuda to work for this Castle Harbor Hotel. But many of these that went to work in the Castle Harbor Hotel, when the hotel was done, they were sent back in the steamships to the Azores. But nevertheless, in the 30s, people kept going to Bermuda, but especially because of the crisis here in the Azores, the decrease of the pineapple exportation, banks going bankrupt. Of course, we're talking about the 1930s, the big crash of 1929, and many people still kept going when they had the chance to go to Bermuda. Also, just around the time of World War II, Bermuda and the Azores, especially more specifically the island of Fayal and Bermuda, helped to connect the two continents, the United States and Europe. And so many of those flying boats that stopped in Fayal, from there they went to Bermuda, and even when they got to Fayal, they had the last stop had been Bermuda. So they used to do many times New York, Bermuda, Fayal, and then Europe. Also, in Darrell's Island in Bermuda, where there was the airport for these flying boats, there was this sign over here you see with the miles, distance of miles, and of course, it's as historians like to use. There is this delicious detail with Horta and Lisbon on that sign on the airport. It was there. Nowadays present in the National Museum of Bermuda. Going to Second World War, that was definitely not an easy period for the immigration. Bermuda government first wanted to kick out, to send back all the Portuguese immigrants in Bermuda, but there was the problem of transport. How do you send back these people if there was a war going on? So with the necessities of agriculture, they suspend repatriation of these immigrants. Also, Bermuda now needed to focus more on agriculture rather than tourism because there was the war, and agriculture became very important. So much so that they suspended repatriation and wanted to import more Azorian immigrants. So 1941, these Azorians were so needed on the agricultural businesses that the Board of Immigration issues a notice on newspaper say that all the Portuguese that had gone to Bermuda after 1936, if they were catched working in other jobs and not agriculture, they could be deported. They really had to remain in agriculture. of course, why they didn't want to remain in agriculture. That's something I'll talk about as well. But so they got to import immigrants from the Azores more October 1941, and they went to Bermuda aboard flying boats. They went from San Miguel to Fayal, and from Fayal they catch the flying boats directly to Bermuda. 1942, more immigrants arrived in Bermuda aboard a steamship, Serpa Pinto, that became famous for the transportation of refugees. And here I have the picture of Serpa Pinto, the Portuguese ship, right in front of Hamilton. I don't know if you remember the church I'd shown you, but that's the church over there. And also during these following years, although there came that advertisement on that notice on the newspaper, Portuguese Azorians kept leaving their jobs in agriculture. What happens that they were analphabet, couldn't read or write most of the times, not even their language, so English even worse. And they signed contracts for lower wages than the Bermudian workers just because they were immigrants. And when they found out that, they started to change jobs and move to other jobs. And that really upset the bosses who wanted to continue to have this very cheap labor for them. 1944, Serpa Pinto steamship takes people from the Azores to Philadelphia, and then from there goes to Bermuda to take people to Bermuda. And a very sad story about the families and how they were separated many times. So in the 1930s, Bermuda started to be more restrict on having families because of too much population in Bermuda, the population density, and started to be 1930s a more male population, more male Azorian immigration. And there was a story I found out, even came in the newspapers, that the gentleman had been separated from his wife and kids for 7 years. He was emigrated to Bermuda, then went back to the Azores to visit his family. His wife got pregnant. He went back to Bermuda, and only 7 years later, the family had a chance to go to Bermuda for good, to emigrate. So they went on the Serpa Pinto to the United States. While they were on the United States, this gentleman in Bermuda went to a surgery and passed away. For 7 years, for so much time, after being separated from his family, when they finally had a chance to meet again, after those 7 years, he died. And when she got to Bermuda, she didn't know. And then the boss of his boss told her about this tragic event. Going into the after World War II, 1945, 1949, it's a very important period of this history. In 1947, Bermuda places new conditions for Azorian immigrants to be imported, very harsh conditions. But this time, the Portuguese government will say no. So August 1947, King Horn, director of Boer Agriculture, and the Azorian Abel Benevic come to the Azores, to the island of San Miguel, to select immigrants. They didn't leave with immigrants, although they applied to. The only thing King Horn left from here was some flowers, including azaleas from the Azores. But negotiations failed because the Portuguese government at the time suspended all the immigration from Portugal. Later, months later, they will create the Board of Emigration, the NE, to organize and control all the immigration from the country. Of course, we're talking about the Estado Novo, the dictatorship at the time, more precisely this time, with Salazar, and then the director of the Board of Immigration, Colonel Batista. The focus of the Portuguese government was to take Portuguese immigrants to the African colonies to get more people there, including to increase the white population in African colonies. Going to 1948, have this consul, Nuno Bessa Lopes, from the Portuguese consul in New York, arrives at Bermuda, gets in contact with agricultural workers, farmers. He wanted to know more about the conditions of the Portuguese immigrants in Bermuda and compare Bermuda to other places. So they were researching, studying all of these places that could absorb the Portuguese immigration. In the case of Bermuda, specifically Azorians. And he criticized Bermuda because he said Bermuda doesn't want immigrants, but agricultural workers. So an immigrant, when people go and supposedly it's to stay and remain. This period is very important also because in 1948, the Bermudian government approves a policy to bring the wives and families of Azorians, Portuguese citizens that had been living in Bermuda for 7 years or more. This is very important, as I'll explain in a few seconds. But in 1949, there are more negotiations with the now Portuguese Vice Consul Maurice Gibbons, and it's possible to import more Azorian workers through cartas chamada, letters of call, that could only be called by Portuguese people or Portuguese organizations, more specifically Vasco da Gama Club in Bermuda. In 1949, also, we have the first Portuguese and Azorian to be Vice Consul of Portugal in Bermuda, Jerónimo de Medeiros, a gentleman from the civil parish of Arrifes in San Miguel. So this is one of all these gentlemen over here. There's four of them. While only this one here on the left is still alive. The other three on the black and white figures, unfortunately, have passed away. But the four of them were part of this 1949 generation. All of them got to Bermuda as kids, as teenagers. This Johnny Pereira for the construction. Luis Bernard was a community leader, architect, leader of the biggest political party in Bermuda. Eddie de Mello, a big businessman, he was a huge figure in the music business in Bermuda. And Tony Cordero was one of the best photographers that Royal Gazette ever had. He was from Rabo de Peixe, Loma de Maia, Ponta Delgada, but his father was from Santa Maria, and Johnny Pereira from Feijão de Sena. Going to the 50s, Azorians kept going to Bermuda for agriculture and for reforestation. In the late 40s, Bermuda had diseases in the trees. Many of them were dying. And so Azorians went to Bermuda to plant all of these trees. But until 49, 50, 51, a lot, and even 52, many dozens of Azorians going to Bermuda. But 52, the migration is suspended. Some problems, and the consul decides to suspend immigration. This will turn out to be a strategy from the consuls in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, and even 80s to argue against Bermuda, on this arm wrestling against the Bermudan immigration, the Board of Immigration, Bermuda government. This would turn out to be an arm wrestling with Bermuda. Also in the 50s, they were starting to have regular direct flights from Santa Maria to Bermuda, direct flights. And it's interesting how sometimes you complain about the distances, the hours it takes flights, but in the newspaper, only 8 hours to the Azores, so from Bermuda to the Azores. 1950s, because of these problems, the Estado Novo, against the Portuguese dictatorship government, sent another inspector to inspect the conditions of the Portuguese immigrants. Also in the 50s, a new gentleman, it's appointed vice consul, João César Guiar, from San Miguel Island as well. And Carlos Fernandes, this gentleman from the Portuguese Foreign Affairs, sees a Portuguese community of around 4,000 people split in three groups. They are the Protestants born in Bermuda, Azorian, Portuguese, and the Catholics, mostly that were immigrants. In 1955, they reached an agreement, and in 1957, the Portuguese government signed this first bilateral agreement, this agreement between the two countries, and has set up a minimum wage of £7 per week with food and lodging, but still no wives and families coming to Bermuda. This only happened with the Portuguese immigrants. No other foreigners, no other immigrants were were forbidden to bring their families or wives to Bermuda. So there, and for example, Henry Vesey, a member of parliament from Bermuda, said it wasn't fair for the Portuguese. They were the only foreigners, and so much so that appeared on the Royal Gazette by related with Henry Vesey. He thought it wrong that nationals of Britain's oldest ally should be prevented from bringing their wives to Bermuda when former enemies such as Germans and Austrians were able to do so. Also related with that, Edward Richards will turn out to be the first black premier of Bermuda and member of parliament and lawyer. He said it was a danger for the community morality because this man left their wives and families in Bermuda and stayed many years they left their wives and families in the Azores and left and went to Bermuda. And some Azorian men had relationships outside wedding with women in Bermuda, white and black, and that's why they're still nowadays. For example, many black Bermudans that their great grandfather was Azorian. Also in the 60s, finally in 1960, because of Maurice Gibbons, that was now just member of parliament, previously vice consul of Portugal, the parliament approves bringing Portuguese wives of all the people that had got to Bermuda before 1957 agreement. And so they started to come. The other ones had to wait 7 years before they could apply to get their families in Bermuda. So it's very common in Portuguese Bermudian culture, these stories of ladies that used to send pictures of the kids to Bermuda because many times they left and they left their wives pregnant when they immigrated to Bermuda. They left their wives with kids, with babies, and when they got to see them again, there were many times kids with 7, 8, 10 years old. But 1960s was the decade when more Azorians emigrated to Bermuda. Of course, why they didn't allow all of these families and wives to go to Bermuda? Well, their argument was that there was the problem of schools. The Portuguese didn't speak English, so it was a bigger problem for the kids and for the wives to insert them in the society. And besides that, also this thing that the Azorians were Catholic, and they would have way more kids than the other immigrants. And according to the politicians at the time, they said, well, while the Germans and the Americans come, they stay for a few times, then go back. While the Azorians, when they come to Bermuda, they really want to stay for good. So that was their argument. But nevertheless, was a very inhumane way to treat these people, the people from the Azores, and discriminating this way. But in the 1960s, that would change. In 1962, we have Philippe Masset, priest that had gone to Bermuda years before, and he becomes vice consul. He will become one of the biggest figures of Portuguese history in Bermuda, supporting the immigrants, telling the abuses of employers to the Board of Immigration, and even telling everything to the government of Portugal, telling them what the employers were doing, what the Board of Immigration were doing. And also explained in 1962 that as soon as Portuguese got documents, as soon as Portuguese became Bermudians, started to have Bermuda status, Bermuda needed new Portuguese. Why? Because these Portuguese started to have their own businesses, started to work less hours, and so Bermuda needed more and more fresh Portuguese for their economy, agriculture, cattle raising, hotels, of course, tourism industry. So much so that in 1964, the conditions were not better, and Philippe Masset, this is from documents that he wrote, found in Lisbon. In cow sheds and hotels, the Portuguese are 100% enslaved people. They arrive at the cow sheds working 100 hours a week without a day's rest and earning half of what any other non-contracted person earns in 50 hours. So not only they were working a lot, as they were not getting rest and were many times earning less than a minimum wage that was set on the agreement. In '64, he got the government got new negotiations for a new agreement, higher salaries. It's true, than the previous agreement. All the professions discriminated on the agreement, but no families coming to Bermuda. Even on the documents from the government of Bermuda, I found this that they say that in these negotiations that we're going to get in with the Portuguese government, they said no incentive should be given to married men to bring their families to Bermuda, and that unless the Portuguese authorities raise the issue, it should not be addressed in the discussions on the new agreement. So they definitely didn't want them to bring. But the Masset was a very tough guy, if you allow me this expression, and he kept complaining to was happening with the Portuguese, that they were not expecting the conditions, namely housing, overtime, weekly rest, wages, and hotels were doing a lot of the abuses after '64, paying less than a minimum wage, and even collaboration with the Board of Immigration. They were accepting Portuguese as tourists as working. So they were contributing to illegal immigration, the Board of Immigration and the hotels in Bermuda. So this was so bad that even foreigners that visited Bermuda started to see how badly Portuguese were treated. And in 1966, the clergy of Bermuda, the religion people, submitted a petition to the governor and the council to improve the situation of the Portuguese and say that this was against Christian morality and not the public interest. And if a very interesting thing is that they say that a natural hardship and unnecessary strain on their moral resources. So they were the other families, of course, they couldn't be more. They couldn't be as happy as if they had their family with them. But in 1968, that's when they have a new agreement. But I really found on the documents from Bermuda where they really admit that they had been discriminating Portuguese compared to the other nationalities. It says here, with regard to discrimination against Portuguese, the board of Immigration has admitted there is discrimination in policy against other Portuguese, against other foreigners. Sorry, there is a mistake here. Against other foreigners. No other aliens are prevented matter of policy. Sorry, in discrimination in policy against Portuguese. No, it's correct. I'm sorry. Against policy against Portuguese, no all aliens are prevented as a matter of policy, being covered by their wives. So Macedo, again, uses the same strategy as in the 50s to block immigration to Bermuda, and again, an arm wrestling against the Bermudian government, and 68, a new agreement is reached. Wives can come after 6 months probation, and wife and kids after 2 years probation, and with adequate accommodation. Going into the 70s, again, there were some problems, and in 1972, delegation from Bermuda goes to Lisbon to negotiate a new agreement, and they finally got a new agreement, and the first Azorians started to go again to Bermuda in 1975. Also, because of this blockade of the Portuguese consul in Bermuda to not get immigrants, to have this arm wrestling against the Bermuda government, hotels started to be desperate for Portuguese labor. Even these advertisements, this news came out on the newspapers like this, big letters. Also, very sad happened in the 70s, was that this lady that was forced to leave Bermuda because the contract was made to her husband and he died, and Bermuda ordered her and her 8 children to leave Bermuda, and they didn't care if she was sent to Canada or the Azores. They just wanted her to leave Bermuda. Mariam da Costa and family happened in 74, and what happens that in the 70s and until 82, if you were a Portuguese citizen, could only apply to certain jobs, and so kids that didn't have Bermuda status, were not Bermudian citizens, were not British overseas, or didn't have Bermuda status, they could only apply to the 4 jobs on the Portuguese contract of 1972. So many families started to go to Canada, especially, but some to the US and even back to the Azores to start their lives again in search for a better life for their kids, where they could just work wherever they wanted. 1977, the first visit from the first president of the Azores, Montamaral, 1977. 1978, there was the rape and murder of Connie Furtado, a young girl with 11 years old, was murdered in Bermuda. Well, it shocked Bermuda and shocked the Portuguese community in Bermuda. And in 1979, Luis Bernard and Eddie de Mel get a medal from the ambassador Vasco Pereira, which were the first people to be recognized with medals in Portugal, in Bermuda, by the Portuguese government. Going to the 1980s, we have a huge catastrophe in Terceira, with an earthquake on the island, and Bermuda makes a donation of $60,000 to the Azores. 10,000 alone were from the government. According to the media at the time, Bermuda was the Bermuda was the place that per capita gave more money to Terceira in this catastrophe. So Azorians got a relief center to made it to help people in Terceira. And in the same year, the premier David Gibbons made a visit to the Azores, and so the first visit from a premier to the Azores, premier from Bermuda. In the 1980s, 1982, of course, a very important agreement. It's the one that's still being used nowadays between authorities of Azores, Portugal, and Bermuda. So Portuguese citizens now could apply to all the jobs that were open for foreigners. Before that, as I explained, 4 kind of jobs: dairyman, gardeners, pot washers, and agricultural laborers. No matter their qualifications. These were the jobs that, just because they were Portuguese citizens, according to the agreements of 72 and before that, these were the only jobs open for Portuguese immigrants. And also established a commitment between the two governments to teach Portuguese in Bermuda, primary school by the kept by the Azorian government and the Azorian community in Bermuda, and high school being responsibility of the Bermudian government. In 1981, Mota Amaral visits again Bermuda as a courtesy trip after the visit from David Gibbons. Into the 90s, that was definitely not an easy decade because there was economic recess. And so what happens that in the immigration in Bermuda, if there is a Bermudian available, he should get the job way before the immigrants. And so as Bermudians were getting unemployed, they were applying to the jobs that they didn't apply before. More precisely, jobs that were occupied were by the Portuguese immigrants. So Portuguese started to get unemployed. And besides that, many parents didn't register their kids, and so they were not Portuguese citizens. And at the same time, they didn't have Bermuda status. So they didn't have any nationality, which was a huge social crisis. So many of them just started to come back to the Azores. When Betty went to Canada, went to the United States, and even Canada, some went to Quebec, which was even harder for the kids and teenagers because besides Portuguese and English, they had to learn French. Also in the 90s, a pressure group is formed, Portuguese Bermuda Organization, PBO, and in 1955, they succeed to lower the age from 21 to 18 to apply to Bermuda status. So this way, when they were reached 18, they could apply to Bermuda status and then, of course, start to work, because this gap between 18 and 21 that existed before was a huge headache for all the young that want to work but didn't have Bermuda status or to apply to a contract. According to Bermuda government, Portuguese were not being being sent out of Bermuda, and they were leaving because they couldn't get other jobs. And he explained also that the Portuguese were very benefited because of laws that he did in the 80s to get some to get Bermuda status. And what happens that the Minister of Immigration was very upset with the press because the press was demolishing the Bermudian government over these Azorians immigrants in Bermuda. And of course, part of the book are life stories of Azorian immigrants in Bermuda, sad stories, happy stories, success stories, failure stories as well. And of course, it's a part of the book that's very interesting, and one of my favorites to get all of these stories of these people that combined together make all of this history. Going to the 21st century, Bermuda is the #1 destination for Azorian immigration, even surpassing the United States. Why? They're specialized labor, and they know what they do. The same materials as in the Azores, and different work ethic. They just want to make money as much as they can, and then go back to the Azores and invest in the Azores. So I interviewed a gentleman called Paul Rodrigues, Azorian descent, businessman in Bermuda, and he was the one who explained me more why even in 2025 Bermuda likes Azorian immigrants. 2002, that situation was a bit resolved with the kids not having status. 2005, Carlos Cesar visits Bermuda, and also celebrations of the anniversaries. In 2016, the new government of Bermuda from the OBA government was trying to grant more status, but there was a huge protest and the law was withdrawn. Something that has been catching for a lot of curiosity of people is how the Portuguese people in the press, when I give interviews, when I talk about the book, is how Portuguese in Bermuda were Azorians, of course, were seen as a third race. So in Bermuda, even culturally nowadays, you speak about black, you speak about white, and you speak about Portuguese. So there's this way of ethnically dividing the society between black, white, and Portuguese. And back in the day, of course, it was way worse. So much so that in the newspaper sometimes it showed up here, as you can see, white or Portuguese. So the person had to be white or Portuguese. To be Portuguese, you just needed a Portuguese surname. And even the census, they segregated the Portuguese from the other white. And also, was the biggest here on the corner on the left. The biggest episode of violence against the Portuguese was happened in the 21st century. But it's funny to say Ban and Faria from PBO, how Bermuda has its magical way of transforming Portuguese nationality into a separate race of its own. So I also part of the book, there are different quotes of these people where I interviewed and also read from small biographies, things like that, how they felt about that. And Portuguese were not allowed in certain clubs, not allowed in certain bars. There were in the 30s, they did public school, Gilbert Institute, just for Portuguese, so to segregate Portuguese kids from white kids and from black kids. And in Bermuda, as I said, surnames and first names are associated with the social construction of the Portuguese as a racial category. Therefore, anglicizing their names and surnames, not speaking Portuguese, and even abandoning Azorian culture and Catholic religion could have been a way for them to socially transform themselves into whites and therefore belonging to the dominant social group. So what happens at white Bermudans of Anglo-Saxon origins look down at the Azorians as a low class on intelligence. Of course, nowadays it's much different, but this was the view that was common. And but with the black community, it was a bigger connection. They worked together, lived together. Many Azorian men married black Bermudian woman, and even had love affairs outside marriage with some of these people. But there is this kind of resentment from the black Bermudians against the Portuguese that cannot be that shows up, cannot be hidden. So the role of the Portuguese Empire on the slave trade in the past. The Portuguese were sometimes placed in jobs that black people were turned down because they were black, because of the color of the skin. Portuguese immigrants were seen as competition for the lowest paid jobs. The idea that white Bermudians introduced Portuguese to contain to the rise of the black Bermudians as a social class. Many Portuguese, when they became anglicized, became white, kind of white in Bermuda reality, and distanced themselves from the black Bermudian community. And some Portuguese, in becoming white, unfortunately, they started to have racist attitudes and even becoming racist. And also the lack of Portuguese interests and support for black causes and typical votes on the party UBP that remained in power until from the 60s until late 60s when Bermuda started to have universal vote until the 90s. On the other hand, Portuguese in Bermuda, even nowadays, are the ones who say, I'm not black, I'm not white, I'm Portuguese. So I met many times Azorians say they were not black, they were not white, they were Portuguese. So it's a thing of its own. So of course, Portuguese market have companies. Portuguese they dominate the gardening, they dominate the construction, supermarkets, agriculture, transportation of goods, like Joe Vieira from Raptapeixe, music business with Eddie de Mello, while the Vasco da Gama Club started in 1936, the oldest Portuguese club in Bermuda. You need to have ethnic Portuguese background to be a member, even nowadays. And of course, Portuguese Association, Portuguese Cultural Association later in the 90s. Portuguese school started with the Azorians in Bermuda, and for the people who know about immigration, usually Azorians, especially in Canada, have less interests in for the kids to know Portuguese. But Bermuda, it's a very specific case, and was started by Azorians because of this instability in Bermuda. And then, of course, 2015, Casa dos Açores, Portuguese Bermudians in Bermuda politics. This lady in pink, she was the first premier, first woman to be a premier. Her grandmother was Madeiran, and these other ones over here also Portuguese descent. So here, Ralph Marshall, Ernest Acudo, Tony Correa, Tessie Terceira, and Trevor Muniz. And of course, in Bermuda, things from Azorian culture. Romaria, there's a group of Romeiros programs that go to the Azores as a group from Bermuda. They do it with Canada or US. Santo Cristo started in 78. Portuguese movies, folklore groups, Holy Spirit starting in the 90s, and of course the Malasadas, known in Bermuda as Portuguese donuts. The Catholic churches in Bermuda, the biggest one is this one on the corner at the left, up corner on the left, St. Teresa's, where the Santo Cristo image is, and of course, well, my time it's getting over, but Portuguese immigration started in 1849. Second half was mainly Azorians, and in the 20th century, that's when hundreds and hundreds of Azorians started to go to Bermuda for agriculture, landscaping, tourism, more recently also construction and other activities. And just quotes here some of these names that were helped to build this community. And of course, that's something that's undeniable. It's on how Portuguese influence what Bermuda is nowadays. Economy, politics, music, religion, gastronomy, and so on and so on. You go from east to west in Bermuda, from St. George's to northwest, respectively, and there are always some Portuguese influence in Bermuda. It's around 25% of the population has some this descended somehow from Portuguese. More specifically, of course, Azorian, the majority. And Portuguese are in Bermuda synonymous with success. So this was from a quote from Correio do Jesus, a newspaper from San Miguel, and where say this is giving news from Bermuda, and would say that where there is a Portuguese man, there is a good man. In fact, our compatriots stand out amongst all other foreigners, with the exception of one other case, or people hardly figure in crime statistics. The Portuguese are competent in all the professions to which they dedicate themselves. They're happy to start with the most humble occupations, with ambition, of gradually rising to the highest positions. The Portuguese are considered to be the workers that employers can trust most. That's why I always say that in Bermuda, Portuguese are synonymous with success. Thank you very much for your attention and for your time.
Excellent. Excellent. That was a great presentation. Fantastic. Lots of information, indeed.
Thank you. I don't know if you, after this, you're still going to read the book.
Oh, I've been reading it, by the way. But the
nice.
one quick question, or
Yes.
we almost out of time, but just a couple of quick questions. So you were in Bermuda for 3 months as part of the research and preparing for the book.
Three.
3 months. Great. So how did you
January to early April.
how did you feel? I mean, obviously you were contacting a lot with Azorians and there and Azorian descents, but how did you? What was your take? Because one thing is to do the research in the Azores or mainland Portugal or in libraries. Another thing is to be in the field for 3 months. How was that experience for you?
Well, it was amazing, right? To be to hearing these stories. As I said, one of my favorite part was those stories of life. To have these people sharing their stories, crying, laughing, telling me these stories of life. Some of them very emotionally, as people can read on the we were able to read on the book, and definitely, of course, an amazing experience. And of course, going to the archives and see all of these documents from the 1800s, 1900s going through. There's days and days and days and afters in the archives searching for what I was looking for. So definitely was very interesting thing to do, very exciting. And in the future, I hope to do also some research in the UK, in the archives from the UK, because possibly they have things from the British Council in San Miguel. That's something that I missed. That already achieved something that's in history. It's hard as you get sources from both sides. That's many times that's not hard because that requires the author, the historian, to move from one place to another one. That well, I really wish I could do that in the UK one day, and in the US as well.
And
Yeah, do I answer your question, or you will
did.
also?
My other question has to do with that statement that you made that quite a few people say, well, and for those who have never been to Bermuda, it is a very heavy population of African descent. So
Yes.
black, and so, but you had that quotes from quite a few people, as you were saying, that say we're not black, but we're not white either. We're Azorian. Why do people
Yes.
classify?
Yes.
In the aspect of, we understand that in America, because in the United States, I should say, because when we talk about um, white versus other ethnicity or other
Mm-hmm.
races, color,
Mm-hmm.
and the when we talk about white, we don't Portuguese don't consider themselves white either in a lot of aspects, because in the United States, it's Anglo-Saxon white, as you mentioned there.
Mm-hmm.
The Azorians weren't either
Yes.
of those, white, Anglo-Saxon and Protestant. And so, do you think that when these people mention to you, I'm not black, I'm not white, I'm Azorian, or I'm Portuguese, I'm Azorian mostly, do they do it with a sense of pride, or do they do it with a sense of, geez, I don't belong anywhere? How did you take that?
They do it on both ways. So in pride, I mean, I'm Azorian. I'm not Anglo-Saxon Bermudan. I'm not Black Bermudan. I'm Azorian. I'm very proud of what my ancestors did. But also, I mean, I don't belong anywhere. For example, I know a gentleman that his family go in Bermuda goes back to 1849. His ancestors came on the first ship, and when people his last name is Moniz. So anytime someone talks with him, oh yeah, you're Portuguese, you're Portuguese, you're Portuguese. And then he told me a story. He was at a restaurant with another gentleman, and this gentleman had a French surname. His family has been in Bermuda for 60 years, while this one in the Portuguese name has been in Bermuda for 175 years. So he was talking with them, and he was like, "You say I'm Portuguese? Yeah, you're." And the other guy said, "You're a Moniz. You're Portuguese." He said, "No, I'm a Bermudan of Portuguese descent." And he said, "What do you think about this fellow over here?" "Oh, he's Bermudian." And he said, "He's Bermudan of French descent. But you look at me as Portuguese, and you look at him as Bermudian." So that happens. And also, I noticed that, for example, Azorians say, "I'm not white, I'm Portuguese," or "I'm not white, I'm Azorian," because in Bermuda, unfortunately, there's many times this prejudice that you're white, your ancestors were lucky, they were not descendant of slaves, they were rich, and they got better salaries. That's why you live better than the other ones. And that was not the case with the Azorians. So that's why they many times say, we're not white, we're not black, we're Portuguese, we're Azorians. There's always this argument, this refusing to be white, because many times when, especially these attacks come many times from the black population, from black communities. Oh, you're white, you're a white boy, you had luck in life. Your ancestors, they were lucky. They were not slaves. They were rich. They were spoiled, socially. And that's why there was always this refuse that they're white.
Yeah, indeed, and so from a different perspective, but that happens here as well, and sometimes that even there's even a distinction between, well, we're Azorian, we're not from Portugal, and a lot of time, and I've heard it from people,
Yeah.
hey, we were left alone in the Azores to defend for ourselves, like many other people in other colonies, so there's that kind of a connection because of
Yes.
our experience as Portuguese citizens, but as Azorians, our experience in the islands is much different than those in the colonial power of the mainland Portugal.
Yes. Yes. And on the West Indies, it happened the same. As I say, they use that word that's in the U.S. People also use the Portuguese or Portuguese, and it can be written many ways. And on the West Indies, Madeirans used to say, "Oh, we're not Portuguese, we're Madeirans," and they were like refusing that word, that people. But they just applied to those people. What language they speak? They're just Portuguese, just like West Indies. What are West Indians? It's a group of countries, and it is just West Indies.
Sure. Yeah, it's interesting how. Well, Eduardo, thank you so much. I appreciate your time. I appreciate the great presentation, and good luck to you. Continue
Thank you very much.
working as hard as you do for the diaspora. We appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure. Thank you. An honor.
Take care.